"You might want to stop laughing," the black cleaner said softly, her voice almost lost beneath the hum of fluorescent lights, but no one heard her over the sound of security chuckling near the glass doors of the executive boardroom, where polished marble floors reflected the pale morning sunlight pouring in from 30 floors above Manhattan, and Angela Brooks stood with a mop handle resting lightly in her hand, her gray uniform slightly faded at the seams, her name stitched in blue thread over her chest, while Daniel Carter, the white security guard posted outside the boardroom, leaned back against the wall with crossed arms and a smirk that carried just enough volume to draw attention from the assistants and junior analysts gathering nearby, because in buildings like Whitmore Global, laughter traveled fast when it came from someone wearing authority, even if it was only a badge and a radio clipped to a belt. And Angela's quiet presence felt like an interruption to that polished world of tailored suits and leather briefcases, her cart parked carefully against the wall as she wiped a faint streak from the glass panel beside the door, her movement steady and deliberate, the way someone works when they know invisibility is part of the job. But Daniel's voice cut through the quiet again, louder this time. "Careful, don't smudge the glass, we've got billion-dollar decisions happening in there," and a few nearby staff members let out restrained smiles, the kind that flicker and vanish quickly, because no one wanted to be openly cruel, but no one wanted to challenge the tone either. And Angela paused, her hand still holding the cloth against the cool surface, feeling the chill seep through the fabric as she glanced briefly toward the digital display mounted beside the door, where a financial projection remained frozen from the earlier setup, a string of numbers highlighted in blue that didn't quite align, something subtle, something small, but enough to catch her eye, because Angela Brooks had always noticed numbers, ever since her father used to sit at the kitchen table with stacks of receipts and show her how decimals told stories, and now that instinct flickered quietly inside her as Daniel laughed again, shaking his head. "You cleaners always pick the best time to wander around," and Angela lowered her cloth slowly, her gaze still fixed on the reflection of the screen in the glass, the faint glow of figures mirrored across the polished surface, her voice barely above a whisper as she spoke again. "You might want to check that projection," but Daniel waved dismissively without even looking, his radio crackling faintly as he adjusted it. "Yeah, I'm sure. The cleaning staff's running the financials now," and the sound of footsteps approached from down the corridor, measured, deliberate, the kind that quieted conversations without needing words, because when Richard Whitmore walked through his own building, the air shifted, and the murmurs faded as the chairman stepped into view, his charcoal suit catching the morning light, his expression calm, observant, and Angela stepped slightly aside, her cartwheel squeaking softly as she made room, her eyes lowering out of habit, but not before she noticed the numbers again reflected in the glass, still misaligned, still wrong, and Daniel straightened quickly, his tone shifting from casual amusement to professional politeness. "Good morning, Mr. Whitmore," while the chairman paused just outside the boardroom door, his gaze sweeping briefly across the hallway, then settling, unexpectedly, on Angela Brooks, who stood quietly with her cloth still in hand, the silence stretching just long enough to make Daniel glance sideways, unsure, and in that still moment, the faint hum of the city below 30 stories down seemed louder than before, the light from the windows spilling across the marble floor, and Angela's reflection stood beside the chairman's in the glass, small, quiet, but steady, as Richard Whitmore's voice finally broke the silence, calm and measured. "Is there something you noticed?" Angela Brooks did not answer immediately, and the silence stretched just long enough for the faint ticking of a wall clock at the far end of the corridor to become noticeable, her fingers tightening slightly around the cleaning cloth as she lifted her eyes again toward the reflection on the glass, her posture still modest, still careful, but there was a quiet certainty in the way she spoke, the kind that did not demand attention yet somehow held it, and Richard Whitmore watched her without impatience, his expression neutral, curious rather than skeptical, while Daniel Carter shifted his weight beside them, glancing between the chairman and the cleaner as if waiting for the moment to end. But Angela finally said, softly and respectfully, that the projected growth rate on the merger display appeared inconsistent with the previous quarter's earnings summary, her voice calm, measured, and she gestured lightly toward the reflection rather than stepping forward, careful not to cross any invisible boundaries, and Whitmore followed her gaze, his eyes narrowing slightly as he studied the faint mirrored numbers glowing across the polished glass, the hallway quiet now except for the distant hum of elevators moving between floors, and Angela added that the margin looked adjusted by less than 1%, but that even a fraction like that could change the valuation by several $1 million when applied across projected expansion over 5 years, and Daniel let out a quiet breath, half disbelief, half discomfort, while Whitmore remained still, his attention sharpening, because Angela's tone did not sound like guessing, it sounded like someone who had seen patterns before. And in that moment the chairman's memory flickered back to earlier meetings where executives debated decimal points as if they were lifelines, and he asked her gently how she noticed it, and Angela hesitated, her shoulders lifting slightly as if unsure whether to answer fully. Then she explained that she often passed through the executive floors during early morning shifts, and sometimes she saw presentations left on screens while cleaning, and over time she learned to recognize inconsistencies, her voice steady but humble. And she mentioned that her father used to work in accounting for a small construction firm in Newark, and when she was younger he would show her spreadsheets at the kitchen table, teaching her how small numbers could hide big consequences, and Whitmore listened quietly, his gaze steady, while Daniel's radio crackled faintly again, the sound oddly loud in the stillness, and Angela lowered her eyes again as if worried she had spoken too much, her hand returning to the cart handle, her posture shifting back into the quiet invisibility she had practiced for years. But Whitmore did not move toward the boardroom door yet. Instead he looked once more at the reflection of the numbers, then at Angela, then back again. And the morning sunlight shifted slightly across the marble floor, casting a narrow band of brightness between them, and Daniel cleared his throat softly, uncertain whether to interrupt, but Whitmore finally spoke, his tone calm, thoughtful, asking which figure specifically concerned her the most, and Angela inhaled slowly, her eyes lifting once more, the faint glow of the mirrored projection catching in the glass beside her as she prepared to answer, her voice quiet yet steady, as if she were stepping carefully across a line she had never crossed before. Angela Brooks lifted her hand slowly, careful not to step closer than she already had, and she pointed gently toward the lower corner of the reflected screen, her finger hovering just inches from the cool glass, and she said that the projected operating margin in the fourth quarter appeared slightly inflated compared to the cost expansion listed in the supporting column, her voice calm but precise, and Richard Whitmore followed her indication, his eyes narrowing as he studied the faint mirrored numbers, the hallway remaining silent except for the distant hum of ventilation and the soft shuffle of an assistant pausing farther down the corridor, while Daniel Carter shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence fading as the chairman leaned closer to the glass, his reflection merging with Angela's in the polished surface, and Angela continued carefully, explaining that the supply chain cost increase appeared to be calculated at 3.2%, but the projected profit margin seemed to assume only a 1.8% adjustment, and she added quietly that over 5 years the difference could widen significantly, especially when compounded across multiple expansion regions, and Whitmore's expression changed slightly, not dramatic, but focused, the subtle tightening around his eye suggesting he understood the implication, and he asked how she estimated the compounded effect so quickly, and Angela hesitated again, then answered that she had once taken 2 semesters of community college business courses before leaving to help her mother after a medical diagnosis, and although she never completed the program, she kept her textbooks and sometimes reviewed them during quiet overnight shifts, her tone humble, almost apologetic, and Whitmore listened without interruption, his attention steady, while Daniel glanced down the hallway as if hoping someone else might step in, but no one did, and the silence deepened as Whitmore reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone, tapping the screen briefly before pulling up the same projection file, the glow illuminating his face as he compared the numbers Angela had mentioned, and the faint tapping of his thumb against the screen seemed unusually loud in the quiet corridor, and Angela stood still, her hands now resting lightly on the cart handle, her breathing slow and controlled, as if she were trying not to disturb the fragile balance of the moment, and after several seconds Whitmore scrolled back through the supporting charts, his posture straightening slightly, and he asked Angela if she noticed anything else, and she paused, her eyes moving again across the reflection, then she mentioned that the regional rollout timeline also appeared compressed, which might increase operational strain, especially if hiring projections did not match training capacity, and Whitmore's gaze lifted to her, the interest in his expression now unmistakable, while Daniel's shoulders stiffened, the earlier laughter now replaced by uncertainty, and the morning light shifted again, brightening the marble floor between them. And Whitmore finally lowered his phone, his eyes still thoughtful. And he asked Angela one more question, his tone calm but deliberate, asking her what she believed would be the safer adjustment, and Angela inhaled softly, her voice steady despite the quiet tension in the air, as she began to explain. Angela Brooks shifted her weight slightly, the wheels of her cleaning cart giving a faint squeak against the polished marble as she gathered her thoughts, her eyes still fixed on the reflected numbers, and she said quietly that the safer adjustment would be to align the projected margin with the higher supply chain cost rather than the lower estimate, her voice steady but careful, explaining that a conservative forecast might reduce short-term appeal but would protect long-term credibility, especially if the expansion entered regions with fluctuating logistics costs. And Richard Whitmore listened without interrupting, his gaze focused, while the distant elevator chimed softly somewhere down the hallway, the sound echoing faintly across the high ceiling, and Angela added that adjusting the hiring timeline by even 60 days could allow for more training capacity, reducing operational strain during rollout, her tone calm and measured as if she were reading from a quiet internal calculation. And Whitmore glanced again at his phone, scrolling through the supporting charts, his expression thoughtful, the subtle tension in his posture suggesting that her reasoning was aligning with something he had already sensed but not yet voiced, while Daniel Carter stood motionless now, his arms no longer crossed, his earlier confidence replaced by an uneasy stillness, and a junior assistant passing at the far end of the corridor slowed slightly, noticing the unusual pause outside the executive boardroom, but quickly continued walking, sensing that the moment was not meant to be interrupted, and Angela lowered her gaze again, her hands returning lightly to the cart handle, as if expecting the conversation to end, yet Whitmore remained still, the sunlight from the windows shifting across the glass and casting a faint reflection across Angela's uniform. And he asked her quietly how she would balance investor expectations with a more conservative forecast, and Angela inhaled slowly, her voice thoughtful as she answered that transparency often built stronger investor confidence, especially when early projections acknowledged potential variability, and she mentioned that her father once told her that numbers that promised too much often created pressure that was harder to manage later, and Whitmore's eyes lifted slightly at that, the faintest hint of appreciation passing across his expression, and he nodded once, almost to himself, while Daniel shifted again, glancing toward the boardroom door as if aware that executives inside were waiting, and Whitmore finally looked back toward Angela, the silence between them calm but charged with quiet recognition. And he asked her one more question, his tone measured and deliberate, asking what she would do first if she were responsible for the rollout, and Angela hesitated only briefly before answering, her voice steady and composed, explaining that she would begin by revisiting the regional logistics assumptions and verifying supplier reliability before adjusting projections, and as she spoke, the hallway seemed to grow even quieter, the morning light brightening the marble floor, and Whitmore listened closely, the subtle shift in his posture suggesting that something in her answer had confirmed more than just a calculation, and when she finished, Angela lowered her eyes again, her expression calm, unaware that the conversation had already begun to change the tone of the entire morning. Richard Whitmore remained still for a moment after Angela Brooks finished speaking, his gaze thoughtful as the morning light shifted across the polished marble floor, and the quiet in the corridor deepened, the kind of silence that felt heavier than before, while inside the boardroom a faint murmur of voices filtered through the closed glass doors, executives waiting, unaware that the conversation outside had already begun to reshape the direction of their meeting. And Daniel Carter cleared his throat softly, his earlier composure now replaced by a subtle unease, as if the air around him had shifted in a way he did not fully understand, and Whitmore finally turned toward the glass doors, then paused, glancing once more at Angela, who stood quietly beside her cart, her posture modest, her hands resting lightly on the handle, as though she expected to fade back into the background at any moment, and Whitmore reached for the door handle but stopped, his attention drawn again to the projection still reflected faintly on the glass, and he opened the door slowly, the soft click echoing in the hallway, and inside the boardroom several executives looked up immediately, their conversations halting as the chairman stepped in, followed by the glow of the presentation screen still displaying the financial forecast. And Whitmore walked to the head of the table without urgency, his expression calm, yet focused, and he asked the team to hold for a moment, his voice steady, and then he pointed to the operating margin projection, asking quietly whether the supply chain cost adjustment had been fully reconciled with the 5-year margin forecast, and the room shifted slightly, a few executives glancing at one another, while the lead analyst leaned forward, reviewing the slide. And he responded that the figures had been modeled using standard assumptions, his tone confident but measured, and Whitmore nodded slowly, then asked whether the compounded impact had been tested under a higher cost scenario, and the analyst hesitated briefly, tapping his tablet, the faint sound of his stylus clicking against the screen filling the room, and the silence stretched as he scrolled through supporting data. And outside in the corridor Angela remained still, her eyes lowered, though the faint sound of voices reached her through the glass, while Daniel stood beside her, no longer smiling, his posture stiff, and after several seconds inside the boardroom the analyst spoke again, this time more cautiously, explaining that the higher cost scenario had not been fully expanded across the full rollout timeline, and Whitmore's expression remained calm, but his gaze sharpened, and he asked the team to adjust the projection and display the revised figures, and as the screen updated, the numbers shifted slightly, the margin narrowing, the projected valuation dipping just enough to change the tone of the room, and several executives leaned forward, their expressions tightening with concentration, and Whitmore nodded once, quietly, then stepped back from the table, his mind already turning, and outside the hallway remained still, Angela standing quietly with her cart, unaware of the subtle shift happening behind the glass, while Daniel glanced at her briefly, then away, the faint hum of the building filling the silence, and after another moment Whitmore exited the boardroom again, the door closing softly behind him, and he paused once more in front of Angela, the sunlight catching the edge of his suit. His expression composed but thoughtful, and in that quiet moment the weight of what had just happened settled gently into the stillness of the hallway. Richard Whitmore stood quietly in the hallway, the glass boardroom door closing behind him with a soft click that seemed to settle the air, and Angela Brooks lowered her gaze again, her hands resting gently on the cart handle as if returning to the rhythm of invisibility she had learned over years of working in buildings where people in tailored suits passed by without noticing her presence, and the morning light shifted across the floor, reflecting faintly off the polished marble and onto the silver frame of her cleaning cart, while Daniel Carter remained beside them, unusually still, his earlier laughter replaced by a careful silence, and for a moment no one spoke, the only sound coming from the distant hum of elevators and the faint murmur of voices continuing inside the boardroom, and Whitmore looked at Angela again, not with surprise now, but with quiet consideration, as though measuring something beyond numbers, and Angela sensed his attention and straightened slightly, her posture respectful but calm, her expression composed, and Whitmore asked gently how long she had worked in the building, his tone conversational but thoughtful, and Angela answered that she had been on the overnight and early morning shifts for almost 2 years, her voice soft but steady, explaining that she usually worked the upper floors before the executive teams arrived, and Whitmore nodded slowly, his gaze drifting briefly toward the city skyline visible through the tall windows at the end of the corridor, the sunlight catching the glass towers beyond, and he asked whether she had ever considered returning to school, and Angela hesitated, her fingers lightly adjusting the edge of the cleaning cloth. Then she explained that she had once planned to finish her business degree, but her mother's medical bills had made that difficult, and she added quietly that she still read whenever she had time, sometimes reviewing old textbooks during breaks, and Whitmore listened without interruption, the calm in his expression deepening, while Daniel shifted his weight slightly, glancing toward Angela with a new uncertainty, and the hallway remained quiet, the stillness almost reflective, as if the moment had slowed the entire floor, and Whitmore asked whether she enjoyed working with numbers, and Angela allowed a faint, modest smile, explaining that she liked the way numbers told stories, how small changes could reveal larger patterns, and Whitmore nodded again, his gaze thoughtful, the faint light reflecting across his watch as he adjusted his sleeve, and Angela lowered her eyes once more, her posture returning to its quiet composure, as if she expected the conversation to end, yet Whitmore remained for another moment, the silence calm but meaningful, and the faint sound of footsteps approached from the far end of the corridor before fading again, and Angela's cart wheels creaked softly as she shifted slightly, ready to continue her work, while Whitmore looked once more at the glass boardroom door, then back at Angela, and the stillness between them carried a quiet recognition. Subtle but unmistakable, as the morning sunlight brightened across the floor and the building seemed to breathe in the calm of the moment. Richard Whitmore remained still for another moment, the quiet between them stretching as the sunlight shifted across the corridor, and Angela Brooks gently adjusted her grip on the cart handle, preparing to move on, her posture calm and composed, when Whitmore finally spoke again, his voice thoughtful, asking her whether she had ever worked with financial models outside of school, and Angela hesitated slightly, then answered that she had once helped her father review small project estimates for local contractors, nothing large, just spreadsheets printed on paper at the kitchen table, and she explained that her father used to say that every number carried a responsibility, especially when other people depended on the outcome. And Whitmore listened closely, his expression steady, while Daniel Carter stood quietly beside them, his gaze shifting briefly toward Angela with a hint of uncertainty, and the distant hum of the building filled the silence as Whitmore nodded slowly, then reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a slim leather notebook, flipping it open briefly as if confirming something, and he asked Angela one more question, his tone calm but deliberate, asking whether she would be willing to look at a broader set of assumptions if given the chance, and Angela blinked slightly, surprised, her hands tightening gently around the cart handle, and she answered carefully that she would be honored to help if it was appropriate, her voice respectful, measured, and Whitmore gave a small nod, then turned toward the glass boardroom door, opening it again and stepping inside, and the executives looked up as he re-entered, their attention immediately shifting to him, and Whitmore walked calmly to the head of the table and asked the lead analyst to bring up the expanded logistic scenario, his voice steady, and the screen updated again, rows of numbers appearing, and Whitmore asked the team to include a conservative hiring timeline and increased supplier variability, and the analysts began adjusting the model, their fingers moving quickly across keyboards, while the room grew quiet, the faint clicking of keys filling the air, and after a few moments the revised projection appeared, the margins narrowing further but stabilizing over the 5-year span, and several executives leaned forward, their expressions thoughtful, and Whitmore nodded slightly, then turned and walked back toward the door once more, stepping into the hallway again where Angela still stood quietly, and he looked at her with calm recognition, the subtle shift in his expression now unmistakable, and Daniel Carter straightened instinctively, the weight of the moment settling across the corridor, and Whitmore spoke softly, his tone measured, telling Angela that her instincts had just helped prevent a costly oversight, and Angela lowered her eyes modestly, her voice gentle as she replied that she was glad if she could help, and the silence that followed felt warmer now, the sunlight brightening across the polished floor as the building seemed to move forward quietly around them. Angela Brooks lowered her eyes modestly after Richard Whitmore spoke, her fingers resting lightly on the worn handle of her cleaning cart, and for a moment the quiet between them felt different, no longer tense but reflective, as if the hallway itself had softened, the sunlight stretching farther across the polished marble floor, and Daniel Carter shifted beside them, his earlier certainty now replaced with something quieter, more uncertain, as he glanced briefly toward Angela, then toward the chairman, before clearing his throat gently, and Whitmore noticed the movement but did not comment. Instead he studied Angela for another second, then reached into his inner jacket pocket and removed a simple white business card, holding it between his fingers with calm deliberation, and Angela looked up slightly, surprised but composed, while Whitmore extended the card toward her, his voice steady as he told her that if she ever considered returning to school or exploring analytical work, she should contact the number on the card, and Angela hesitated, her expression soft with disbelief, her hand still on the cart handle as if unsure whether to accept something that felt far beyond her usual world, and Whitmore waited patiently, his posture calm, and after a moment Angela reached out slowly and accepted the card, her fingers careful, almost reverent, as though the small piece of paper carried more weight than it appeared, and Daniel watched quietly, the faint hum of the building filling the silence, and Angela thanked Whitmore softly, her voice sincere but restrained, and Whitmore nodded once, then added gently that talent often appeared in unexpected places, and Angela lowered her eyes again, her expression thoughtful, the faint reflection of the card visible in the glass panel beside her, and the quiet settled again, calm and steady, while a few distant footsteps echoed faintly down the corridor, and Whitmore turned slightly toward the boardroom, preparing to return, then paused once more, glancing briefly at Daniel, whose posture straightened instinctively, and Whitmore gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not reprimanding, not lecturing, but enough to shift the atmosphere, and Daniel responded with a subtle nod of his own, his earlier smile gone, replaced by a respectful stillness, and Whitmore then stepped back toward the boardroom door, opening it quietly and re-entering, leaving Angela standing beside her cart, the card resting gently in her hand, and she looked down at it for a moment, her breathing slow and steady, before carefully placing it into the pocket of her uniform, her movements calm and deliberate, and she turned her cart slightly, the wheels rolling softly across the marble, as she resumed her work, the sunlight catching the faint outline of her reflection in the glass, and Daniel stood quietly beside the door, his gaze following her for a brief second before returning forward, and the hallway returned to its usual rhythm, but something in the air had shifted, subtle and quiet, like the beginning of a new pattern forming beneath the surface. Angela Brooks guided her cart slowly down the corridor, the wheels rolling softly across the polished marble as the morning sunlight stretched farther along the floor, reflecting faintly against the glass walls of the executive level, and the building gradually returned to its familiar rhythm, footsteps echoing in measured patterns, elevator chimes sounding in the distance, and quiet conversations beginning again behind closed doors, while Angela moved with the same steady pace she had always kept, her posture composed, her expression calm, though the small white card resting in her uniform pocket felt heavier than its size suggested, and she paused briefly near the tall window at the end of the hallway, adjusting the cloth in her hand as she wiped a faint streak from the glass, the skyline of Manhattan unfolding beyond her, sunlight glinting off distant towers, and for a moment she allowed herself to breathe slowly, the reflection of her figure blending with the city beyond, quiet and steady, and behind her Daniel Carter remained near the boardroom door, his stance more reserved now, his gaze thoughtful as he watched Angela continue her work, the earlier laughter replaced by a quiet respect that needed no words, and he glanced briefly toward the boardroom, where muffled voices carried through the glass, then back toward Angela, before returning his attention forward, his posture composed, and Angela continued down the corridor, stopping at each glass panel, her movements precise and careful, the routine familiar, yet the morning felt subtly different, as if the air carried a new sense of possibility, and she reached another window where the sunlight poured across the floor, creating a long reflection that stretched beside her cart, and she paused again, her hand briefly brushing the pocket where the card rested, her expression thoughtful but calm. And in the distance a group of executives stepped out of an elevator, their conversation low and focused as they passed, barely noticing her presence, yet the quiet confidence in her posture remained, subtle but unmistakable, and inside the boardroom Richard Whitmore stood near the head of the table, listening as analysts reviewed the updated projections, his gaze thoughtful as he glanced once toward the glass wall, where the faint outline of the hallway reflected back at him, and he nodded slightly, returning his attention to the discussion, while outside Angela resumed her steady pace, the wheels of her cart gliding softly, and the sunlight shifted once more, illuminating the polished floor beneath her feet, and the building continued its quiet motion, the hum of work, the rhythm of decisions, and Angela Brooks moved forward through it all, calm and composed, her reflection stretching beside her in the glass, and the silence that followed felt warm, steady, and quietly filled with the sense that something meaningful had begun, even if no one spoke it aloud.